On the morning of June 4th, 1,942 four Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming toward a small American island called Midway. By sunset, all four would be burning wrecks at the bottom of the Pacific. It was the greatest naval defeat in Japanese history. It was the moment the war in the Pacific turned. And the men who commanded those carriers, the admirals, the captains, the officers on the bridge, did not see it coming until the bombs were already falling. This is the story of what those men said and thought and did in the hours their empire lost the war. It begins 6 months earlier, in a quiet room in Tokyo. 6 months. That was all he promised. 6 months to run wild across the Pacific. After that, he could guarantee nothing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spoke the words to Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in September 1940. A quiet room in Tokyo. 15 months before Pearl Harbor. He was 56 years old then. Precise. Missing 2 fingers of his left hand torn away by an exploding shell on the deck of the cruiser Nishin at Tsushima 35 years earlier, when he was a young ensign. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had walked the assembly lines of Detroit. He had seen the smoke of American steel. He knew what Japan was about to do. He knew it could not be won. He planned the attack anyway. By the first week of June 1942, almost 6 months to the day had passed since his bombers rose over Pearl Harbor. To the day his prophecy was about to come true. He did not yet know it. But the countdown he had spoken of in that quiet room had already reached 0. Salt air. The low vibration of turbines under the deck plates. The date was June 3rd, 1942. The place was a stretch of empty ocean 600 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The Japanese First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, moved through calm water in a formation that had never been defeated. 4 fleet carriers steamed together in a diamond. Akaga. Sōryū. Around them battleships. Cruisers. A shield of steel 3 miles wide. For 6 months, this force had crossed the Pacific like a moving thunderstorm. Pearl Harbor. Rabaul. Colombo, 2 British battleships sunk in a single afternoon off Malaya. Not one Japanese carrier lost. Not one battle refused. Now it was steaming toward Midway. Toward a small coral-ringed island 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. Toward what its commanders believed would be the final blow. Destroy the American Pacific Fleet. End the war. Force a peace on Japanese terms. The plan belonged to Yamamoto. The execution belonged to the man standing on the bridge of the flagship Akagi. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was 55 years old. He had a broad, weathered face, gray at the temples, eyes that did not blink often. He wore a plain summer uniform, no medals visible, hands clasped behind his back in the naval posture of 30 years of service. He had commanded the Kido Butai since before Pearl Harbor. He had never wanted the job. Nagumo was a torpedo officer, a destroyer specialist. He had spent his career on the surface narrow, fast ships, close-range gunnery, night battle doctrine. He knew ballistics. He knew formation. He did not know aircraft. He had never flown. He had never sat in a cockpit. Of the men on his own bridge, several understood carrier warfare better than he did. But seniority was seniority. When the combined fleet reorganized in 1941, Nagumo held the rank. Nagumo received the command. He had led the strike on Pearl Harbor with reluctance. He had led every operation since with the same careful, methodical hand. He did not gamble. He did not improvise. He read the manuals. He followed the doctrine. 6 months of victory had confirmed that this was the correct way to fight. Now, on the eve of Midway, he studied a chart of the Central Pacific on the bridge table. The chart was clean. The intelligence was thin. He believed the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. That was what naval intelligence had told him. That was what the entire plan assumed. He did not know that 2 of those carriers had already sailed. He did not know that they were now roughly 200 miles from his own position, waiting northeast of Midway. He did not know that everything he was about to do had already been read. 1,000 yards to starboard, a smaller silhouette cut through the dawn light. Hiryū, youngest of the 4 carriers. Fastest. And aboard her, on a bridge no larger than a suburban living room, stood the man Nagumo trusted least among his subordinates, because Nagumo did not trust any man who trusted himself as completely as this one did. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi was 49 years old. He was short, thick-shouldered, dark-eyed. He wore his cap low over his brow. He had studied at Princeton in the early 1920s. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He spoke English fluently, and he spoke it without deference. In peacetime, he had drunk with American officers, matched them cup for cup, and beaten them at every game they played. He believed Japan would win the war. He believed Japan would win it because men like him refused to lose. Before the fleet sailed, Yamaguchi had argued loudly to anyone who would listen that Midway should be struck with all 6 of Japan's fleet carriers. All 6. Overwhelming force. 1 strike. No reserve. He had been overruled. 2 carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had been left behind after the Battle of the Coral Sea, one damaged, the other missing her air group. Yamamoto had chosen not to wait for them. The Midway operation was time-locked to the moon, the tides, and the intelligence window. It could not be delayed. So the Kido Butai sailed with 4 carriers instead of 6. Yamaguchi did not forget. He watched from Hiryū's bridge, and he waited for the moment when his aggression would be needed. The moment would come. Not in the way he expected. Below the waterline of the Akagi, in a small cabin lit by a single bulb, a man lay on a cot. His name was Minoru Genda. He was 37 years old. A commander. The most gifted air operations officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was Genda who had planned Pearl Harbor. Genda who had designed the doctrine of the 6-carrier strike. Genda who understood, in a way Nagumo never would, that the aircraft carrier was not a support ship, it was the battleship of the coming age. He should have been on the bridge. He was in bed with pneumonia. His fever had been rising for 2 days. Nagumo had ordered him to rest. Genda had refused to be transferred off the ship. He would fight from a bunk if he had to. He had studied the Midway plan for months. He knew every timing, every launch cycle, every ordnance rotation on the hangar decks below. In the hours to come, when the moment of decision arrived, Genda's mind, the one mind on the Kido Butai that might have caught the error, would be dulled by fever, buried inside a body that could barely stand. There is no record of what he thought as he lay there. There is only the fact that he was there. And the fact that no one came to ask him. At the same hour, 4,000 miles to the east, a very different room was lit by very different bulbs. The basement of an old administrative building at Pearl Harbor. Steam pipes overhead. Cigarette smoke thick enough to cut. A row of steel desks, each piled with typewritten sheets, cross-indexed cut, and hand-drawn chart. At the center of the room, a man in a smoking jacket and slippers stood over a map of the Central Pacific. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He was 42 years old. A lieutenant commander. Head of Station HYPO, the U.S. Navy's cryptanalysis unit for the Pacific Theater. He had not slept in a bed for nearly a month. He worked in a bathrobe because uniform slowed him down. He drank coffee by the pot. He ate sandwiches brought to him at his desk. For half a year, his team had been reading fragments of the Japanese naval code known as JN-25. Not all of it. Not clean. Perhaps 25% on a good day. Enough to trace a movement. Enough to guess a pattern. Enough to know that something enormous was coming. By mid-May, the pattern had become clear. Traffic surged. Ship names appeared. Task organizations formed. And one 2-letter designator kept surfacing again and again in the Japanese messages, AF. AF was the task. Rochefort was almost certain AF was Midway. His superiors were not. Admiral Ernest King in Washington believed the Japanese target might be the Aleutians. or the American West Coast, or Hawaii itself. To send the entire Pacific carrier fleet north to Midway on Rochefort's guess would be to risk the last defense of the United States on the word of a lieutenant commander in a bathrobe. Rochefort needed proof. He asked his commanding officer, Admiral Chester Nimitz, for permission to run a test. Said yes. The test was simple and it was elegant. In the third week of May 942, the American garrison at Midway was ordered to send a plain language radio message. The message stated that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. The island was running short of fresh water. Please advise on emergency resupply. The message was in English. It was sent The Japanese would hear it. That was the point. Rochefort waited. 2 days later, a Japanese naval message was intercepted and decoded at Station HYPO. It reported that AF was suffering a shortage of fresh water. That was it. That was the proof. Fizzed. The trap had confirmed itself. Rochefort brought the intercept to Nimitz personally. Nimitz read it once. He set the paper down. He looked at Rochefort for a long moment. Then he began to move the American fleet. There was one more gift. On its regular schedule, the Japanese Navy should have replaced JN-25 with a new version of the code weeks before Midway. The keys should have rotated. The code books should have been reissued. The window Rochefort was reading through should have slammed shut. It did not. Logistical problems. Distribution delays. Ships at sea that could not be reached with new code books. The change was postponed first by a few days, then by weeks. Enough for Rochefort's team to keep reading. Enough for the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to be moved into position northeast of Midway. Enough for the ambush to close. Yamamoto did not know. Nagumo did not know. Yamaguchi did not know. Not one of the officers steaming toward Midway suspected that their radio traffic had been read, their target identified, their timing calculated, and their approach route mapped by a man in a bathrobe in a Pearl Harbor basement. They believed they held the initiative. They believed surprise was theirs. They were sailing into a trap that had been set for them almost 3 weeks earlier. Night fell on June 3rd. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo received the final weather report. Clear skies expected at dawn. Light wind. Good visibility. Excellent conditions for launching aircraft. He nodded. He gave the order for pre-dawn preparations. Below on the flight decks and in the hangars of 4 carriers, the machinery of war began to move. Mechanics ran final checks on the Aichi dive bombers, the Nakajima torpedo planes, the Mitsubishi Zeros. Ordnance crews rolled bombs and torpedoes from magazines to lift points. Pilots ate a light breakfast in the ready rooms. Some prayed. Some wrote letters home. Some slept. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, engines began to turn over on Akagi's flight deck. Blue exhaust flame. Propellers whirring against the last stars. 108 aircraft would launch in the next 30 minutes. Their target was Midway Atoll. Their mission was to soften the island's defenses for an amphibious landing that was scheduled to follow. Nagumo stood on the bridge and watched them go. He was confident. He believed the plan was sound. At that same moment, roughly 200 miles to the northeast, on the flight decks of USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, American aircraft were also warming up. They knew where he was. He did not know where they were. At 5:34, Japanese scout aircraft reported enemy ships far to the northeast. Not carrier, just ship. Nagumo read the report. He did not know yet what he was looking at. He did not know that in less than 5 hours, 3 of the 4 carriers beneath his feet would be burning wrecks. He did not know that by the end of the day, the Kido Butai would no longer exist. He did not know that the war Japan had been winning for 6 months was about to be lost inside a single morning. He only knew what the message said. 10 ships, bearing northeast. Distance 240 miles from Midway. He read it once. Then he read it again. And on the bridge of the Akagi, on the morning of June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a torpedo officer commanding an air fleet, a cautious man commanding an aggressive doctrine, a man who did not know that his enemy already had his hand on his throat, turned to his staff and asked the only question that mattered. Where are their carriers? No one answered. Because no one knew. The question hung in the air. Where are their carriers? No one on the bridge of the Akagi could answer it. And in the silence that followed, the machinery of a battle already lost began to turn. It was a few minutes past 7 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. The sun was climbing. The sea was calm. And Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was about to make the first of 4 decisions that would destroy his fleet. The scout report had come from a float plane launched off the heavy cruiser Tone. The Tone carried 2 HYPO reconnaissance float planes on catapults amidships. Long-range aircraft. Reliable aircraft. In theory, they were the eyes of the Kido Butai, a search fan spread across 300 miles of ocean, watching for exactly this moment. In practice, one of those aircraft, the No. 4 float plane, assigned to the sector where the American carriers actually were, had launched roughly 30 minutes late. A mechanical delay on the catapult. A routine problem. A small problem. A problem that meant for the first critical hour of the search, an empty patch of sky sat over the exact ocean where the enemy waited. By the time the Tone No. 4 reached its patrol line, the American task forces had already turned into the wind to launch their own strikes. The pilot saw ships. He counted 10 of them. He radioed the sighting back to the fleet at 7:28 in the morning. Bearing 01, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course south-southeast. Speed over 20 knots. He did not say what kind of ships they were. He did not know. From altitude, cruisers and carriers look similar. A trained observer with binoculars can tell them apart. An exhausted pilot at the end of a delayed launch, squinting through morning haze at silhouettes 18,000 feet below, cannot. So the pilot reported what he saw. 10 ships. No mention of carriers. On the Akagi, Nagumo received the message and read it twice. Then he made his first decision. He had already committed his first strike 108 aircraft against Midway itself. Those planes were now over the atoll, dropping bombs on runways and fuel tanks and gun emplacements. In reserve on the hangar decks of all 4 carriers, Nagumo had held back 93 more aircraft. These were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Weapons designed for ships. The doctrine was clear. You do not commit your reserve until you have a confirmed target. And a confirmed target, in June of 1942, meant enemy carriers. The scout had reported 10 ships. He had not reported carriers. At 7:13 minutes before the Tone sighting, Nagumo had already issued the order to rearm the reserve aircraft with land bombs. The plan was to strike Midway again. Complete the destruction of the island's defenses. Prepare for the landing. On the hangar decks of 4 carriers, ordnance crews had already started work. Torpedoes came off aircraft. Wheeled carts rolled them across the steel plating toward the elevators. Land bombs came up from the magazines. Fuses were checked. Racks were prepared. It was slow. It was heavy. It was labor that could not be reversed in minutes. Then the Tone message arrived. Nagumo read it. 10 ships. No carriers reported. He allowed the rearming to continue. Nothing in the doctrine said otherwise. 12 minutes later, at 7:40, the Tone scout sent a second message. Ships identified. Enemy force appears to consist of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo read the message. His shoulders eased. Cruisers. No mention of carriers. Not even a hint. This was familiar. This was manageable. The Americans had sent a surface force to protect Midway. Perhaps to intercept the Japanese invasion convoy that was still steaming toward the atoll. It was the kind of decision an American admiral caught by surprise might make. The Kido Butai was not built to fear a surface force. It was built to annihilate one. Nagumo turned to his staff. His voice was calm. Continue rearming with land bombs. We will complete the second Midway strike, recover the first strike, then deal with the surface force at leisure. The staff officers wrote down the order. At that moment, 180 miles to the northeast, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were launching every aircraft they had. The first American strike wave was already climbing into the sky. Nagumo did not know. He believed he had all morning. He had less than 3 hours. At 7:45, another radio message reached the Akagi's bridge. This one was different. It came from Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, the commander of the first strike now returning from Midway. Tomonaga's message was short. A second attack on Midway is required. Enemy defenses remain operational. It was not what Nagumo wanted to hear. He had hoped one strike would be enough. It had not been. The runways were cratered but usable. Anti-aircraft batteries were still firing. Fuel tanks still stood. Midway was still a threat. And now Nagumo faced a specific problem. His first strike over 100 aircraft would return to the carriers in about an hour. They would be low on fuel, some damaged, all needing to land. They could not circle indefinitely. They had to come down. But the flight decks were about to fill with the second Midway strike, the reserve aircraft now being rearmed with land bombs. A carrier cannot launch and recover at the same time. Nagumo had a decision to make. Either send the reserve aircraft off immediately, clearing the decks, or hold them below and let the first strike land first. If he sent the reserve off, he would launch a partial strike against Midway. If he held them below, he would delay the second strike, but recover his returning pilots safely. He chose to hold them below. It was the safer decision. It was the decision the doctrine encouraged. It was also the decision that placed nearly 100 armed aircraft, dozens of torpedoes, dozens of bombs, and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel inside the enclosed hangar decks of his 4 carriers at the exact moment when the American strike was inbound. He did not know it was inbound. Not yet then. At 8:20 in the morning, a third message from the tone scout crackled through the radio room. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one aircraft carrier. The bridge went still. Nagumo read the message. He read it again. An aircraft carrier. The words did not fit. The scout had said cruisers. The scout had said destroyers. Now the scout said a carrier. But the scout also said appears to be. Not confirmed. Not certain. Perhaps a mistake. But if it was not a mistake, if there was even one American carrier where none should have been, then everything Nagumo had believed about this morning was wrong. He looked out at his flight decks. His first strike was still an hour from returning. His reserve aircraft were mostly rearmed with land bombs. Some still had torpedoes. Some had neither, caught halfway through the ordnance change. To launch a strike now against a carrier, he would need to reverse everything. Bring the torpedoes back up from below. Take the land bombs off. Re-rig the rack. Refuel the aircraft that had been sitting on the hangar deck. It would take another hour. Or he could launch immediately. A partial strike. Whatever aircraft happened to be armed correctly at this moment. Send them out. Delay nothing. He looked at his staff. His staff looked at him. 1,000 yards to starboard on the bridge of the Hiryū, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi had received the same intercept. He did not hesitate. He signaled Nagumo directly by lamp in a message that took less than 30 seconds to transmit. Recommend immediate launch of attack force. Yamaguchi had aircraft ready. 18 dive bombers on the Hiryū's flight deck, still armed from the earlier alert. He could launch them within minutes. He was asking for permission. He was also quietly telling Nagumo what he believed the answer should be. Nagumo read the message. He did not answer immediately. Below in his cabin, Commander Minoru Genda's fever burned at over 103 degrees. He could hear the running feet in the passageway. He could hear the intercom traffic. He knew something was happening. He tried to sit up. He asked the corpsman what was going on. The corpsman told him what he had overheard. 10 ships to the northeast. Now possibly a carrier. Genda's face changed. He forced himself up on his elbows. He knew what should be done. Launch whatever was ready. Launch it now. Every hour of his career had taught him that lesson. But Genda was not on the bridge. Genda was 3 decks below, in a fever, and no one was carrying his words up. On the bridge, Nagumo studied his flight decks through the windows. The decks were not empty. They were not ready. The reserve aircraft were still being cycled. His fighters were up on combat air patrol, orbiting the fleet low on fuel. His first strike was inbound 40 minutes out, with damaged aircraft that could not stay aloft. If he launched now, he could send perhaps 30 aircraft. Perhaps 4. A partial strike, unescorted, without proper fighter cover, against an enemy of unknown strength. If he waited 1 hour, he could recover the first strike, rearm all his reserves with torpedoes, refuel his combat air patrol, and launch a full coordinated strike of over 100 aircraft. The proper way. The doctrine way. The way the manuals prescribed. Every Japanese naval officer of Nagumo's generation had been taught the same lesson. A partial strike was a wasted strike. Prepare. Commit fully. Break the enemy in a single blow. This was not cowardice. It was orthodox. Nagumo turned to his operations officer. Recover the first strike. Complete the rearming with torpedoes. Prepare a full coordinated attack against the enemy carrier. The staff officer wrote down the order. At that moment, the flight decks of 4 carriers began the reverse process. Land bombs only partially loaded came back off the racks. Torpedoes, which had been rolled away just an hour earlier, were rolled back. On every hangar deck, ordnance carts crossed and recrossed. Fuel lines snaked across the steel. Aviation gasoline pooled in low speed. There was no time to return the removed bombs to the magazines. There was no time to secure them properly. They were stacked against the bulkheads, wherever space allowed. Dozens of them. On every carrier. Beside torpedo. Beside fuel line. An accident waiting for a spark. The scout's message had been correct. There was a carrier out there. There were, in fact, 3 of them. Enterprise. Horn Yorktown. At that same moment, on their flight decks, over 150 American aircraft were airborne, forming up, turning toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. They were not waiting for permission. They were not calling for reinforcement. They were coming. At 9:18 in the morning, the first of them appeared. They came in low. Not dive bombers. Not high-altitude bombers. Torpedo plane. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators from the carrier Hornet. Old aircraft. Fabric-covered control surfaces. Cruise speed barely 100 knots. They had lost their fighter escort in the confusion of the launch. They had lost their dive bomber support. They came alone. They were led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron was 41 years old. He had told his men the night before that if only one plane got through, he wanted that pilot to press home the attack. He had told them he wanted them to remember the words of Nelson. Do your duty. His squadron went in. The Japanese combat air patrol saw them coming. The Zeros. Machine gun fire tore into the Devastators. One by one they fell. The first one hit the water and cartwheeled. The second exploded. The third lost a wing and rolled onto its back and burned as it went in. Waldron pressed on. He was shot down before he could release his torpedo. 14 more went in behind him. 14 more were shot down. 15 out of 15. One survived. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water beneath his overturned seat cushion, watched the rest of the battle from the ocean. The Japanese gunners on the Akagi cheered. On the bridge, Nagumo watched the last Devastator burn. He allowed himself, for the first time that morning, a small feeling of relief. The American attack had come. The American attack had been slaughtered. The doctrine was working. The Kido Butai was intact. He did not yet understand what had really happened. At 9:25, another wave came in low. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the carrier Enterprise. 14 aircraft. 10 were shot down. Their torpedoes missed. The Zeros descended lower. The anti-aircraft gunners on every ship tracked wave height targets. Every eye on the fleet turned downward toward the horizon, where the slow torpedo planes kept coming. At 10:15, 12 more devastators appeared. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the carrier Yorktown. 10 were shot down. Their torpedoes missed. Across nearly an hour, the American torpedo squadrons had committed 41 aircraft to the attack. 35 had been destroyed. Not one torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. It looked from the Akagi's bridge like the greatest one-sided victory of the morning. It was not. It was a trap. The Japanese Zeros every fighter Nagumo had aloft to defend his fleet had been pulled down to the waves. They were at 300 feet, at 500 feet, chasing the last surviving devastators back toward the horizon. They were out of position. Their fuel was low. Their ammunition was spent. The sky above them was empty. And in that empty sky, at 18,000 feet 32, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers were arriving. No one on the Akagi was looking up. The dive bombers had almost turned back. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McClusky, 40 years old, commander of the Enterprise Air Group, had led his 32 Dauntlesses to the last reported position of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fleet was not there. McClusky had a decision to make. His fuel was low. His pilots were tired. If he turned back now, he could still make it to the Enterprise. If he searched further, he might find the enemy, or he might send his entire squadron into the ocean. He searched further. He turned northwest, following a hunch following the direction he thought the Japanese might be running. He found nothing. He was minutes from turning back when he saw far below on the empty ocean a single wake. A destroyer. Cutting a white line across the water at high speed heading northeast. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi. She had been dropping depth charges on an American submarine that had strayed too close to the fleet. Now, having lost contact, she was racing back to rejoin the Kido Butai. She was moving in a straight line. She was pointing at her own fleet like an arrow. McClusky followed her. 10 minutes later, he saw them. 4 fleet carriers. 2 of them turning. Aircraft on their flight decks. No fighters at altitude. No warning. He rolled his Dauntless into a steep dive. 31 aircraft followed him. On the Akagi's bridge, a lookout screamed. Nagumo. He looked up. He saw dark shapes plunging out of the sun. He said something. No one recorded it. Perhaps he said nothing at all. What his officers remembered later was the way his face changed. Not fear, just the sudden collapse of the certainty he had carried on his shoulders for 6 months. The Dauntlesses came down at 70 degrees. Nearly vertical. Air brakes extended. Bombs slung under their bellies. The first bomb missed the Akagi. It exploded in the water alongside, throwing up a white column of spray that rose higher than the flight deck. The second bomb struck. It hit amidship. It punched through the flight deck, through the upper hangar deck, and detonated inside the ship, among the reserve aircraft, the ones fully fueled, fully armed, with torpedoes and bombs and racks of ordnance stacked against the bulkheads, because there had been no time to stow them properly. The Akagi's hangar deck erupted. Aviation gasoline caught fire. Torpedoes cooked off. Bombs detonated. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship faster than any damage control party could reach them. The fire mains lost pressure within minutes. The internal communication system failed. The flight deck buckled from below. Nagumo felt the ship shudder. Then a lookout screamed again and pointed to starboard. 1,000 yards away, the Kaga was disappearing under geysers of water. The dive bombers from Enterprise had split. Half had gone for the Akagi. The other half, a larger group, had rolled onto the Kaga. The Kaga was the largest carrier in the fleet. She was also, by chance, the one closest to McClusky's approach line. 4 bombs struck her in rapid succession. One hit the bridge and killed her captain, Jisaku Okada, instantly. The others punched through the flight deck into the hangars, and the same catastrophe that had begun aboard the Akagi began aboard the Kaga. Fuel, ordnance detonation, ruptured steam line. Men on. Within a minute, both carriers were burning. Then came the Sōryū. She had been steaming to the north of the formation. Her captain, Ryusuke Kalimoto, was on the bridge. He was 48 years old, and he had been a naval officer for 31 years. He had seen enemy fire before. He had never seen anything like this. 17 Dauntlesses from the Yorktown, a separate group led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived at the Sōryū almost simultaneously with McClusky's attack on the Akagi and the Kaga. 3 bombs struck the Sōryū in 3 seconds. Her flight deck tore open like paper. Her hangars filled with fire. The same catastrophe. She burned as fiercely as her sisters. 3 carriers struck within roughly 6 minutes of one another. On the Akagi's bridge, Nagumo stood in slowly thickening smoke. His flight deck was warped. His hangar was an inferno. His engine still turned, but his fire mains were dead, and there was no way to fight the flames. An officer grabbed his arm. "Admiral, the ship cannot be saved. You must transfer your flag." Nagumo did not answer. He was looking out at the Kaga. She was listing. Black smoke was pouring from her length. She was still turning, still moving under her own power, but she was a floating pyre. Beyond her, the Sōryū burned brighter than the sun. "How can she be lost?" Nagumo said quietly. It was not clear which ship he meant. He did not seem to be asking anyone. Aboard the Kaga, Captain Jisaku Okada had died in the first strike. His bridge had been vaporized. Command fell to the executive officer, Commander Takahisa Amagai, an aviator who now found himself commanding a ship he had never expected to command at the moment of her death. Amagai gave the orders to fight the fires. The orders were followed. The fires were not stopped. Within 20 minutes, the Kaga's engines failed. She lay dead in the water, burning from bow to stern. Damage control parties were driven back by the heat. Sailors began to jump. Aboard the Sōryū, Captain Yanagimoto refused to leave. He stood on the bridge, or what remained of it, and directed the evacuation of his crew. When his officers tried to convince him to abandon ship, he shook his head. He would not leave the Sōryū. He was carried later to the rail and asked one last time to save himself. He refused. He remained aboard. He sang, according to one witness, an old naval song as the ship went down beneath him. The Sōryū sank at 7:13 in the evening. On the Akagi, Captain Taijiro Oki appeared on the bridge with his uniform torn and his face black with smoke. He was 50 years old. He had been the ship's commanding officer for less than a year. Now he had to give the order that no captain wants to give. "Admiral, you must transfer. I request permission to remain with the ship." Nagumo looked at him. He nodded slowly. At 10:28 in the morning, 6 minutes after the first bomb struck, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Kido Butai, descended from the bridge of the Akagi and crossed by line to the destroyer Nawaki. He was 55 years old. He had commanded the greatest carrier force in the history of naval warfare. He had lost 3/4 of it in 6 minutes. Behind him, the Akagi burned. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room and read the message. He read it twice. He removed his glasses. He folded them carefully. He placed them on the chart table. His Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Motomi Ugaki, stood beside him. "All 3 carriers?" Yamamoto asked. "Confirm." "Akagi?" All burning heavily. Yamamoto did not. He did not move. Ugaki wrote in his diary that Yamamoto seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. The architect of Pearl Harbor. The man who had warned Kono that Japan could not win. The man who had, nevertheless, designed the war Japan was now losing. He sat down slowly at the chart table. He did not look up. "And Hiryū?" he asked. "Hiryū is She was separated from the main formation. The American attack did not find her." Yamamoto nodded one. "Order Hiryū to counterattack. Order all remaining forces to converge. We may yet save the operation." The order was given. But Ugaki, watching him, saw what the staff did not see. The prophecy Yamamoto had spoken in September of 1940 had just come true. The countdown had reached 0, and Yamamoto knew. One carrier left. That was what Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi understood, standing on the bridge of the Hiryū in the smoke-smeared light of that June morning. 3 sisters burning to the south. Akaga. Sōryū, great pillars of black smoke climbing into the Pacific sky visible from 30 miles away. Each column marked a ship of 20,000 tons. Each column marked 2,000 men. His ship, the Hiryū, was untouched. She had been steaming apart from the main formation. The American dive bombers had not found her. She still had her flight deck. She still had her aircraft. She still had her crew. She was, for a few hours more, the last operational carrier of the Kido Butai. Yamaguchi was 49 years old. He had argued for 6 carriers instead of 4. He had been overruled. Now he had one. He would use it. At 10:54 in the morning, 18 HYPO dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters lifted off from the Hiryū's flight deck. They were led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, one of the ship's most experienced strike leaders. Their orders were simple. Find the American carrier. Sink her. They followed the retreating American aircraft north, tracking them across the empty ocean. At noon, they saw ships on the horizon. A screen of destroyers. A cruiser war. And in the center, a single carrier, turning into the wind to recover her own aircraft. Yorktown. Kobayashi's dive bombers pushed over from 12,000 feet. American Wildcats climbed to meet them. Anti-aircraft fire opened up from every ship in the screen, a wall of black smoke and steel. 10 Japanese aircraft were shot down in the approach. But 8 got through. They released their bombs. 3 struck the Yorktown. 1 tore open the flight deck. 1 ignited fires in the funnel and killed the boiler room crews below. 1 penetrated to the 3rd deck and exploded among the men, fighting the fires that were already spreading. The Yorktown's engines lost power. She began to slow. Black smoke poured from her stack until it merged with the low clouds above. Kobayashi's surviving pilots turned back toward the Hiryū. Kobayashi was not among them. His aircraft had been shot down over the target. He was 32 years old. On the Hiryū's bridge, Yamaguchi received the report. He allowed himself a moment. Not a smile. Not a... Just a small knock. He had struck. He had damaged. He had proven, in the middle of a catastrophe, that a single carrier under aggressive command could still hit back. This was what he had argued for all his career. This was why he had wanted 6 carriers instead of 4. Aggression. Weight of numbers. Overwhelming the enemy before the enemy could recover. He did not know that a second American carrier, the Enterprise, was operating just 20 miles from the Yorktown. He did not know that a third, the Hornet, was operating with her. He believed there was 1 American carrier. He believed he had crippled her. He ordered a second strike prepared. At 1:30 in the afternoon, 10 Nakajima torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryū. They were led by Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga. Tomonaga was the same officer who had commanded the first Midway strike that morning. His aircraft had been damaged over the atoll. Its left fuel tank had been punctured by anti-aircraft fire and could not be repaired. He had enough fuel in his right tank for a one-way flight. He knew this. He took off anyway. Before he climbed into his cockpit, his ground crew tried one last time to offer him a different aircraft. He refused. He was the strike leader. This was his plane. He would fly this plane. A witness on the flight deck later remembered his salute. It was brief. It was formal. It was the salute of a man who did not expect to return and did not want anyone to say it out loud. At 2:43 in the afternoon, his torpedo planes found the Yorktown. She was underway again. American damage control had performed a small miracle, restoring power in less than an hour, and she was steaming at 19 knots when the Japanese came in low across the water. Tomonaga released his torpedo. He did not pull out. His aircraft was struck by anti-aircraft fire and went into the sea. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown. Her power failed. Her rudder jammed. She lay dead in the water, listing sharply to port. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, gave the order to abandon ship. He believed she was finished. The Japanese pilots returning to the Hiryū believed the same thing. They also believed they had sunk a carrier one of one. They were wrong on both counts. The Yorktown would not sink until 2 days later, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine that stumbled onto her drifting hulk. And she was not the only American carrier in the water. At the Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had been listening to the radio traffic since morning. He was 55 years old. He was calm. He was methodical. He had inherited command of Task Force 16 from Vice Admiral William Halsey, who was in a Hawaii hospital with a severe skin condition. Spruance had never commanded carriers in battle before this day. He was doing it well. At 2:45 in the afternoon, a scout aircraft from the Yorktown reported the exact position of the Hiryū. Spruance did not hesitate. He ordered a strike. At 3:30, 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise took off 14 of them, refugees from the Yorktown, recovered and refueled on the Enterprise's flight deck. They climbed to 19,000 feet. They turned northwest. They flew for 2 hours across a sky the color of steel. At 5 in the afternoon, they found the Hiryū. She was steaming at high speed, her flight deck crowded with the last aircraft the Kido Butai possessed. A second strike was being prepared. She was almost ready to launch it. The dive bombers pushed over. On the Hiryū's bridge, a lookout screamed. Yamaguchi turned. He looked up. He saw the Dauntlesses coming down out of the setting sun. He did not run. 4 bombs struck the Hiryū. 3 of them detonated on the forward flight deck near the elevator. The elevator itself was blown upward, a slab of steel weighing many tons, and thrown against the front of the bridge structure. It came to rest at an angle, blocking the view forward. Below, the hangars caught fire. The same catastrophe that had consumed the other 3 carriers now consumed the 4th. Ordnance. Aviation gasoline. Bombs stacked against bulkheads because there had been no time to secure them. The Hiryū burned. Her engines still turned. For hours they turned. She steamed through the afternoon, and then through the evening, and then into the dark, a burning ship in a black ocean, her crew fighting fires they could not stop. Damage control parties were driven back by the heat. Every attempt to reach the forward hangar failed. Men collapsed at the fire main from smoke inhalation. The pumps died one by one. By midnight, the fires had reached the aviation gasoline stores, and the ship began to shudder from below with a rhythm that no man aboard mistook for anything but the end. At around 3 in the morning on June 5th, her engines finally failed. The Hiryū drifted, silent except for the fires. Yamaguchi ordered the crew to abandon ship. He did not intend to leave. The crew assembled on the aft flight deck. Those who could stand stood. Those who could not were carried. There were more than 800 of them. Many were wounded. Some were burned so badly that their uniforms had fused to their skin. Yamaguchi climbed onto a small raised platform and addressed them. He spoke briefly. He took responsibility for the loss of the Hiryū and the Sōryū, the 2 carriers of his division. He said the fault was his and his alone, and that no man of his division should carry it home. He told the men they had done their duty. He told them to continue serving the emperor. He turned to the ship's captain, Tomeo Kaku. Kaku was 49 years old, the same age as Yamaguchi. They had known each other since their days at the Naval Academy at Etajima 30 years earlier. They had been classmates. They had been friends. Kaku said quietly that he would stay aboard as well. Yamaguchi did not argue. The two men saluted the crew. Then they walked forward together, past the wreckage of the bridge, to a small clear space on the starboard side of the island structure. The crew filed off. Boats and rafts pulled away toward the destroyers waiting in the dark. Some of the men, looking back, could see the two figures on the burning ship, two silhouettes against the fire. There was a moon that night, nearly full, high in the sky. A witness who transferred to a destroyer later reported that Yamaguchi and Kaku shared some biscuits and a small cup of water. They looked at the moon. They spoke a little. Yamaguchi said something about the beauty of the night. Kaku agreed. Then the destroyer moved off, and they were left alone with the ship. At 5:10 in the morning on June 5, 1942, the destroyer Makigumo received the order to scuttle the Hiryū. She fired 2 torpedoes into the burning hulk. The Hiryū rolled onto her starboard side and went down. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with her. They were both 49 years old. The other carriers had gone before her. Sōryū had been abandoned in the afternoon. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanaga, 48 years old, had refused to leave the bridge. When his officers tried to carry him off, he ordered them away. He remained aboard alone. Witnesses on the destroyer picking up her crew reported that they could hear him, faintly singing an old naval song called Umi Yukaba. If I go to the sea, my body may be washed by the water. If I go to the mountain, my body may be covered by the grass. I shall die by the emperor's side. I shall never look back. The Sōryū sank at 7:13 in the evening. Kaga followed at 7:25. Her captain, Jisaku Okada, had been killed in the first attack. Her executive officer, Commander Takahisa Amaga, an aviator, had commanded her death. She burned for 9 hours before her magazines finally let go. Akagi burned through the night. She was still afloat at dawn on June 5th, engines dead, flight deck warped and glowing where the steel had been softened by fire. Yamamoto initially refused to allow her to be sunk. She was the flagship. She was the symbol of Japanese naval power. To scuttle her was to admit what had happened. By 5 in the morning on June 5th, he could no longer refuse. The order was given. 4 destroyers fired torpedoes into her. Akagi went down at 5:20 in the morning. The Kido Butai, the greatest carrier force in the history of naval warfare, had ceased to exist in less than 24 hours. 300 miles to the west, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the final reports as night fell on June 4th. All 4 carriers gone. 248 aircraft lost. Over 3,000 men dead, including a large number of the master mechanics and aircrew training instructors who could not be replaced. American carriers still operational and still hunting. The Midway invasion without air cover, impossible. He sat at the chart table for a long time. Ugaki, standing at his shoulder, later wrote that Yamamoto did not weep and did not curse. He only looked at the map, and then he looked away, and then he looked at the map again. For nearly an hour, he considered whether to press on. He had 11 battleships within range. He had heavy cruisers. He had destroyers. If he could bring the American fleet to a night surface engagement, before their carriers could strike again, he might still salvage something. But Spruance did not oblige him. The American admiral, after recovering his aircraft, turned east and withdrew during the night. He would not chase the Japanese battleships into the dark. He would not risk his carriers on a gamble. Yamamoto understood near midnight that the battle was over. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, he issued the order. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. Ugaki watched him sign it. He wrote later that Yamamoto looked, in that moment, like a man signing his own death warrant. He was the Kido Butai, or what remained of it, turned west and steamed for home. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo transferred his flag from the destroyer Nawaki to the light cruiser Nagara, He gave few orders. He spoke rarely. Officers who entered his cabin found him sitting in a chair, staring at nothing. Once, an aide overheard him murmur, almost to himself, the question he had first asked at 7:28 the previous morning. How did they know? He never received an answer aboard the Nagara. He would not learn for years the truth about JN-25, about Station HYPO, about the man in the bathrobe at Pearl Harbor, about the plain language radio message from Midway that had confirmed everything, weeks before he sailed. He would only carry the question home. Japan buried the defeat. The survivors of the 4 carriers were quarantined at a naval base in Kyushu. Wounded men were held in isolation wards sealed off from other patients. Enlisted men who might have talked were transferred to remote garrisons in the South Pacific, where their letters home could be censored and their conversations monitored. Officers were forbidden to discuss the battle. The families of the dead were not told the truth for many months. Some were never told at all. The Japanese public was informed that the Battle of Midway had been a great naval victory. Newsreels showed cheering crowds. Radio broadcasts described enemy carriers sinking. Newspapers printed maps with arrows pointing toward Hawaii. None of it was true. The truth was that Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, nearly 250 aircraft and 3,000 men in a single day. The truth was that the combined fleet would never recover. The truth was buried and the war went on, and the men who knew the truth carried it in silence. Nagumo was reassigned to shore commands. He would never again lead a carrier fleet in battle. For 2 years he was moved from post to post. 3rd Fleet, 1st Fleet, Central Pacific Area Fleet. None of the commands were what he had once held. Some of them were commands in name only. He was in the way of navies everywhere, being kept out of the way. In February of 1944, he was assigned to command the Central Pacific Area Fleet, with his headquarters on the island of Saipan in the Marianas. In June of 1944, the American fleet arrived off Saipan. 15 fleet and light carriers, 900 aircraft, Marines waiting in the transports. Nagumo had almost no. He had a garrison of soldiers and sailors. He had a headquarters in a cave. The American landings began on June 15, 1944, 2 years and 11 days after Midway. The fighting lasted 3 weeks. On July 6th, with American troops closing in on his position with the garrison broken with no reinforcement possible, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took his own life. He was 57 years old. The man who had commanded the greatest carrier force in the history of naval warfare died in a cave on a Pacific island with no ship under his feet, no flag over his head, and no answer, still, to the question he had asked on the burning bridge of the Akagi. Yamamoto did not survive to see Saipan. For 10 months after Midway, he continued to command the combined fleet. He continued to plan. He continued to give orders. But something in him, according to those closest to him, had gone quiet. He no longer spoke of victory. He no longer spoke of the enemy at all in the way he once had. He wrote letters. He played shogi with his staff in the evenings. He looked at times like a man who was waiting for something. On April 14, 1943, his headquarters at Rabaul sent a radio message. The message was routine. It described an inspection tour Yamamoto planned to conduct in the Solomon Islands 4 days later. It listed his aircraft, his route, his arrival time, and his fighter escort. The message was sent in the naval code. The naval code was still being read by Station HYPO. It had been read for 18 months. It was still being read. The intercept reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor within 24 hours. Nimitz consulted Washington. The answer came back within hours. The mission was authorized. On April 18, 1943, 1 year, and 4 days after the Doolittle raid, and 1 year, 44 days after Midway had already begun to end him, 18 American P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal. They flew low over the water for over 400 miles. They arrived over Bougainville at exactly the moment Yamamoto's transport was descending toward its landing field. They climbed. They engaged. They shot down 2 Japanese bombers. Yamamoto's body was found the next day in the jungle, still strapped into his seat, thrown from the wreckage. He had been holding his ceremonial sword. He was 59 years old. The same intelligence method that had killed the Kido Butai at Midway had now killed the man who commanded it. The circle had closed. The men who survived Midway carried it with them. Genda, who had lain in his cabin with a fever while the ships burned above him, recovered from his pneumonia and returned to duty. He would help plan the air defense of the home islands. He would live until 1989. He would spend the rest of his life explaining what had gone wrong at Midway and why. He continued to serve under Yamamoto's successors. At the end of the war, on the day of Japan's surrender, he flew a final kamikaze mission and was killed. Captain Taijiro Aki of the Akagi survived the war. Survivors of that morning would describe years later the same thing. Not the bombs, not the fire, not the men they had lost. The silence. After the bombs, there was a moment when no one spoke. Officers stood on smoke-filled bridges looking at one another because there was nothing to say. They had just watched their entire strategy burn. That was what the Japanese admirals had said in the hours after their carriers were destroyed. Not defiance, not even grief. Only silence and the slow understanding that the war they thought they were winning had turned against them in a single morning and could never be turned back. 6 months. That was what Yamamoto had promised in the quiet room in Tokyo in September of 1940. 6 months of running wild. And then no guarantees. Pearl Harbor to Midway. Almost exactly 6 months. He had been more accurate than he ever wanted to be. There is one more thing worth saying. When Nagumo asked, on the bridge of the burning Akagi, how the Americans had known, he was asking the right question. He would carry it for the rest of his life without ever hearing the full answer. The answer was in a basement in Pearl Harbor. The answer was in a bathrobe and a pot of coffee and a message about a broken water plant. The answer was in a Japanese naval code that should have been changed weeks earlier and was not, because ships at sea could not be reached with new codebooks in time. The answer was in a float plane launched 30 minutes late. The answer was in a destroyer racing back to its fleet in a straight line, pointing at its own carriers like an arrow. The answer was in a torpedo squadron that flew in low and slow and was slaughtered to the last man, and in doing so, pulled the Japanese fighters down to the waves and left the sky above the fleet empty. The answer was in every small piece of the morning of June 4th, 942, arranged in an order no admiral could have foreseen. The Americans had not won by being braver. They had won by being red. And the Japanese admirals, Nagumo on his silent cruiser, Yamamoto at his chart table, Yamaguchi on his moonlit deck, Kaku beside him, Genda in his fever, Aoki in the water, had gone into that morning believing they held the initiative, and had come out of it with the knowledge that they had never held anything at all. That knowledge was what the silence held. That knowledge is what the world remembers. That is what the Japanese admirals said as Japan's carriers were destroyed. Nothing. For a long moment, they said nothing at all. And in that silence, an empire heard its future.